The diesel breathed like an old sleeping thing, an animal that had swallowed too much dust and refused, and decided, for the afternoon at least, it no longer wished to wake. Its belly, the engine bay, was open to the sky, oil, smudged like a private face. Men clustered at the edges as if drawn by the low, smothered potential. Their conversation was seasoning and rumor, punctuated by metal clinks and the clattering laugh of someone who thinks a person with grease on their hands is less likely to have thunder in their throat. Nida stood where the oil met the concrete, a broom in one hand and a rag in the other, and watched the engine the way some women watch a small child sleep, with a secret inventory of the breaths, a mapping of what might shift and why. She was wearing the work-stained shalwar her mother had given her 3 winters ago, sleeves rolled, hair tied in a rope at the nape of her neck. To Bilal, who had arrived with neatly folded blueprints and a branded thermos, she was the comfortable background of the garage. The woman who boiled tea, swept up metal shavings, and answered the phones in the bone, white light between noon and prayer. To Farouk, the old mechanic who owned the place, she was the daughter of the man who used to handle the heavy repairs with an intuitive tenderness that people mistook for old habit. To Maliha, her 16-year-old daughter, Nida was a map of possibilities embroidered with small, stubborn choices. Bilal had been called in because the town's only ambulance, an aging Toyota that had ferried more births and bleeds than anyone could count, had choked and died at the worst possible time. The district hospital needed it running again. A mother in labor had been waiting in the ward for an hour, while the night nurses argued about taxes. Bilal arrived in sensible shoes and a confident hurry, the sort of man who had learned to make decisions in meetings where there were no hands to be dirtied by work. He had a degree, he said twice, and a toolbox that clicked like a watch when he moved. He loved diagnostics because they were clean numbers, error codes, the vocabulary of absolutes. He liked proofs. Farouk had welcomed him with an eye the color of river stones and a shrug that meant, do what you must. Farouk kept the secret that the workshop's true engine was a patchwork of memories. A pager left under a bench, a name scribbled in red ink on a greasy notebook. But he'd reached a point where his shoulders no longer obeyed the muscle memory required to lift pistons. The government wanted the ambulance working, the hospital wanted the liability gone. Bilal fit neatly into those requirements, educated, presentable, and willing to be impatient on the clock. The first attempt was a parade of polite certainty. Bilal opened a laptop, connected a cable, and read out an alphanumeric string that made the other's eyes glaze. He spoke of fuel injectors and compression ratios, as if reciting scripture. The engine coughed, answered with a single, spasmodic wheeze, and stalled. He frowned and tapped the screen. He took the engine apart with the slow, methodical care of a man who believed paper would have told him what to expect if only the world used standard fonts. He bent over diagrams, measured pressures with a gauge that smelled of plastic and newness, and chalked up the problem to a flaky sensor or corrupt mapping data. Tell me, he said, not looking up, to anyone who would listen, and to Nida in particular. Do you know what a camshaft does? The question was a steel trap that didn't expect an answer. People laughed. Someone tossed him the wrench with an amused slowness. Nida kept her face in noting mask. She knew what a camshaft did. She'd watched her father replace more than one, fingers moving with the memory of years. But she did not wear the kind of answer that would soften his show of superiority. There were other ways to be clever in this town, quiet ones, and she was not the sort to hand applause to anyone who demanded it. Bilal, when the engine refused to live by his numbers, did the thing men do in rooms where expectations are fragile. He turned to Spectacle. If a woman from the floor can fix it, he said suddenly, as if inventing the thought in the air, I will take full responsibility for the mess and leave it to her. But if she can't? He did not finish the threat. He didn't have to. His eyebrows formed the well-defined arc of someone who had just made a small, comfortable wager. The room buzzed with the peppery sound of men digesting the word. Woman. Attached to. Fix. They imagined the comedy in it. They imagined Bilal's comfortable victory. Farouk shifted his weight and said nothing. Maliha's grip on Nita's sleeve was a frictionless plea. Inside Nita's chest, a slow, patient anger rose like the copper smell that sometimes came from the engine's interior old heat. Familiar, burning in remembered places. She thought of father. The way he had hummed to pistons like lullabies. The way his hands stained her school books without apology. She thought of the first small wrench he had given her when she was 12, how it had felt like a secret key. She thought of the mornings she had wiped his face with a cloth after a long night at the lathe, and how he had told her in a voice like gravel, "Learn it, Nita. Know what sings when it's healthy." He had died before she could turn the secret into a certificate. The world could call her simple. All it pleased, simplicity, she had learned, sometimes meant refusing to invent where there was not. So she wiped her hands, put the broom aside, and walked to the ambulance. Her footsteps were not fast. They had the deliberate rhythm of a metronome set to a song she remembered. "Are you sure?" Maliha mouthed, but Nita had already opened the hood. The crowd drew a line like a sea held back by an invisible dam. Bilal's face tightened, a man surprised that the joke had actually yielded a contestant. He looked at Nita as if he were trying to read the fine print on an unfamiliar bill. Nita knelt like a woman tucking herself under a table to hide. She did not pull out a tablet or start with an error code. She did what her father had taught her. She listened. With her ear near the valve cover, she heard the engine's silence, as if it were a language. It was muffled. It was thirsty. A faint metallic tick, not the rhythmic rhyth of a timing issue, but a high, intermittent rasp, spoke of air where there shouldn't be, of a system that had drunk its own breath. She ran a hand along the fuel line and felt the coldness of constriction. She smelled the diesel, and somewhere behind the fuel's sour sweetness was the scent of stale almonds. A subtle sign to those who paid attention that the filter had been starved. Hydrocarbon atoms angry and drying. She touched the filter housing and found it warm, which meant the pump was trying like a man with a throat tight from smoke. Her fingers came away with a black crescent, a smudge that was the history of long masseuse. "Check the fuel return," she said simply. Her voice was low but steady. "And the lift pump. If the pump can't get fuel in at the right pressure, everything else will lie to you." Bilal blinked. His mouth was a small, surprised "oh." The men shifted, their jokes momentarily stuck. Farouk watched with an expression like a man remembering a line from an old song. Maliha exhaled like someone letting go of a held breath. Bilal, consulting his instruments, argued the numbers. "The sensor shows. Sensor shows what you expect it to show when the pump is trying," Nita said. She pulled the filter canister free by hand. It had been installed crooked, the sealing ring pinched. Maybe someone had been in a hurry. Maybe someone had been careless. Maybe that someone had been Bilal's predecessor or a desperate driver patching things at night. It didn't matter. The imperative was the same. She drained the filter and found a slug of water down in the bottom, clear as a trapped moon, and above it the diesel, grayed and tired. Water in diesel makes engines sulk and choke. She put her ear over the pump and felt the small thump of the diaphragm as it tried to swallow and failed. Then she smiled. Not a big smile, but a thin, private one. Because once the cause is known, the work is a tidy thing. She retrieved a small syringe from the drawer where Farouk kept odds and ends. A drawer in which a child's marble, a rusted coin, and an old photograph lived together like uneasy relatives. She used the syringe to bleed the filter, and the lines pumped until clear diesel flowed like a small, obedient river. She tightened the filter, adjusted the clamp on the return line, tapped a coupling free of the hairline crack that had let air in like a cough into the system. It was, she knew, the sort of problem that would trick the best diagnostics air in, false sensor readings, inconsistent pressure. A straightforward problem dressed in the finery of complex instruments. When she turned the key, Bilo flinched as if bracing for the joke to continue. The engine responded first with a coughing complaint, then with a deepening recognition, and finally it woke, not galloping, but like a horse regaining its feet. It settled into a steady, patient idle that made the air in the garage shimmer. It was the sound of an old thing remembering its name. For a moment, there was no sound at all except that engine. Then, the garage erupted whistles, whoever up, a dozen men flowing toward Nita with the first, clumsy version of applause. Maliha grabbed Nita's arm and cried out, a laugh braided with relief. Even Farouk smiled, an opening floodgate. Bilo stood with his laptop under his arm like a relic. For an awkward breath, he looked as if the floor might swallow him. Lucky guess, he said, the phrase dropping like a hand to an empty pocket. His voice was defensively small. Nita did not shout. She wiped her hands on her shower with the same methodical care she had used on the filter. Not guess, she said. Listening, her eyes flicked to Bilo with no triumph, only a soft tiredness that was older than the moment's heat. It's been a long time since someone bothered to listen. People circled and asked questions, offering small new positions in the narrative. Some said the engineer had been right. Some said Nita must have used her father's secret. The debate was a kettle that would be simmering by dinner. But beneath the conversations, a new currency passed. The look in Maliha's eyes, the way workers leaned in when Nita moved. Respect is not a thing that can be coded into a certificate. It is something like sound that moves through the bones, and in that moment it was audible. Bilo stepped forward and did the thing he had thought he would never do. He offered his hand to Nita. It wasn't a wide gesture, but it was honest. I misread it, he said. I should have checked the filter. I assumed the sensors were enough. She took his hand. His grip was both nervous and grateful, like someone unmoored, finally finding a dock. Their palms were the same kind of human map, small scars, a print of a lifetime of choices. He looked at her, and in that glance something rearranged, a recalibration of what counted as expertise. The irony of the town is it loves to celebrate the spectacular and then forget the quiet. But some moments carve their own memory. That night, after the men had drifted away in smaller groups and the engine hummed into silence for maintenance, the workshop smelled of oil and cardamom. Someone had left a kettle on the back table, and Farouk called Nita over. Your father, he said at last, because the old men always start stories as if the beginning were a secret to be unfolded. He used to hum like that when he fixed the pumps. Wouldn't take money for small jobs. Said people needed things, not signatures. Nita's throat tightened. The memory of her father rose up in the shape of an old wrench, its handle smooth from years of love. He taught me the listening, she said, and how to stop the bleeding of a line without the book. Farouk rubbed his chin and smiled with the difficulty of someone who to maintain both the present and the past. You could take the apprenticeship in the city. There's a firm looking for people who can do both field work and diagnostics. They pay good. The suggestion hung like steam between them. Maliha had been applying for a scholarship. Nita had been saving pennies in a jar with a lid that never seemed to loosen. There were practical reasons to go steady wages, the possibility of more than a few nights of rest without worry. There were practical reasons to stay. The workshop had been part of the town's spine for decades, and Farouk's shoulders were losing their firmness. There was also the private reason, the one that felt like a stone in her pocket, that the world saw her as simple, and she was tired of being simple where it meant small. That night, at home, Maliha hovered over the evening light like a lighthouse keeper who has kept the lamp burning for too long. "You were incredible," she said. "You made it sing." Nita rinsed the rag and hung it by the window. "It wasn't a miracle," she said. "It was listening. And a filter?" She laughed softly. "There are more complicated things people do, but they're often complications to cover something small, like an excited person who buys a new suit instead of learning a trade." Her laughter was a small bell. Maliha sat on the floor with a pile of school books and traced the margin with a pencil. "You should go," she said. "I want." Her voice fluttered. "I want you to teach me, and then I can go with you. I don't want the town to only ever need you to fix old ambulances. I want—" She stopped. Dreams are sometimes big and dangerous things to offer. Nita knelt and put her hands on Maliha's shoulders. "I want that too," she said. "More than you know." She looked out the window at the thin ribbon of road that led to the city, a black vein stamped across the dusk. But not everything leaves like the wind. Some things stay, and if I left, Farouk would have to sell the place. This garage is more than metal. It is people's hands. I can't just pick it up. Maliha's face closed with the grief of someone balancing love and ambition. The conversation could have split them, but instead it braided them. In the days that followed, a small, public negotiation began. The hospital wrote a letter of thanks. A local television crew came and made a hurried, respectful segment in which Bilal spoke of diagnostics, and Nita, off camera, accepted the bouquet of sugar, sweetened tea, and the nods of approval with an odd reluctance. For a while, the town's talk was salt, heavy with pride. But success rarely arrives cleanly. The firm that Bilal had worked for called him back to the city. A promotion, they said, because he had shown leadership. He left with a last text to Farouk: "Good luck." He did not call Nita. He did not ask Maliha to teach him to listen. He boarded a bus in the town, watched him go, another cloud moving across a field. Before he left, however, something uncomfortable rose. A local entrepreneur with interests older than the hospital's gratitude suggested that the ambulance be taken for long-term maintenance contract under a new company. One that had money and the right kind of signatures. The contract would, if accepted, mean Farouk's shop would no longer be the place where ambulances slept between calls. It would centralize work in a facility in the city where Bilal's colleagues could bill by the hour and turn paper into profit. There was the temptation, thin and bright, in the entrepreneur's offer: a renovation promise, new equipment, a walled-off hothouse of modernity. For Farouk, it was a practical threat. For Nita, it was a kind of erasure. The workshop had always been a public place, a bench where men and women sat and traded small news, a place where Maliha had once sat under the table and memorized the names of spark plugs like a nursery rhyme. It was where Nita's father had taught her to listen. When the town council convened, the room was packed. Men in neat vests argued points with the cruel efficiency of lawyers. The entrepreneur spoke of progress. The hospital administrator spoke of standardization. When it came Nita's turn to stand, she felt the room shrink to the size of her breath. She had not intended to speak. Respect, she thought, was not won in halls. She learned fast that sometimes the thing that saves an old place is not just sentiment, but the ability to make a better argument. She told the council about the night of the engine, about the way air had slipped into the lines, and how a drop of water in diesel can make a vehicle feel like a person whose throat is full. She spoke simply, avoiding the stageful language the entrepreneur favored. But there was fire in her voice now that had nothing to do with drama and everything to do with refusal. "Keep people alive with these hands," she said. "You want to take that away from where the people are. Who will teach them then?" The entrepreneur smiled, like someone who had never had his sense of loss recognized. "We'll give them better tools," he said. "Standardized training." "You can't standardize listening," Nita replied. "Not when the noise is different in every town. The city models will teach them how to map a part on a computer. They won't teach them how to feel when a pump is thirsty. You can't put that in a spreadsheet." Her argument was not a flourish. It landed because it was rooted in daily reality. Maliha sat in the back and watched her mother's hands gesture, small and uncompromising. People came to the workshop because they trusted the steadiness of its judgment, not the color of its invoices. The council voted to keep the ambulance maintenance local, with the proviso that the workshop would institute formal records and some minimal documentation. It was a compromise, both practical and symbolic. In the quiet that followed, Bilal walked back into town. He had been in the city for 2 months, his sleeves washed and his tie still a foreign thing to him. He had been promoted and then gently counseled to return to grassroots projects if he wished to remain with the firm. Their models loved novelty but feared grassroots messiness. He missed the weight of an engine hood and the smell of oil like bone, deep comfort. He missed a place where failure could be measured in smudges rather than in headlines. He found Nita sweeping as she always had, the broom a small, precise instrument in her hand. He came up behind her and hesitated, like someone not certain whether they ought to open a window in the rain. Farouk was in the doorway, turning a bolt with the slow concentration of someone who had survived long storms. "I wanted to say thank you," Bilal said. His words were a thin rope thrown across a river. "For the night, and for..." He searched for a way to say, "I was wrong," without making himself smaller than he felt he could be. "For showing me there are things I can't see from a screen." Nita looked at him, and then at Farouk, and the three of them laughed like people sharing a private weather report. The laugh broke some last, brittle distance. "I don't want apologies," she said. "I want better colleagues. If you ever come back to work here, come to learn, not to teach. The town isn't a project." Bilal nodded, and something like relief settled in his shoulders. He stayed for tea. He asked Maliha, shyly, if she would show him the tools. She found him an old set of feeler gauges, the cousin of the diagnostic he was used to, and showed him how they fit between the valve and the cam. He learned slowly and with the humility that comes from the willingness to be a beginner again. Nita watched him, amused and patient, and in his mistakes she saw a mirror of their shared humanity rather than an enemy. Word spread, as it does in small towns, but it did so gently. The garage took on an odd new shape, informal apprenticeships in the afternoon where Maliha guided youngsters through tasks and where Bilal, now partly converted, sat with a manual and learned to make his screen's answers match the skin's truth. Farouk's hands relaxed and grew steady. His laugh returned with the seasons. The entrepreneur found other contracts. The town's need for a human center remained. Nita's life did not rearrange into some fairy tale. She did not suddenly become a celebrated engineer with a plaque. There was no grand ceremony with a ribbon cut only as a symbol. Her rewards were quieter. Maliha's scholarship came through because someone had noticed the girl's steady attendance at a volunteer class, and the money that had once been locked in jars with lids loosened into small, daily possibilities. Nita's name began to be used around the workshop without the preface. Just, a small linguistic mutation with an outsized consequence. On a late autumn afternoon, when the light was the precise gold of brass and the shadows lay thin as signatures, Nita stood by the ambulance and ran her hand along its flank. The vehicle had a new shine, someone had buffed the paint. Children rolled marbles nearby, their small faces smeared with dust, and Maliha read aloud from a book about circuits in the shade. Bilal checked a belt, whistled a little tune he had learned, and Farouk told a story about a man who could name engines by the scent of their breath alone. Nita thought of her father and the wrench bone, smooth from use. She thought of the moment she had first decided not to be small, not because she wanted to be showy, but because a life can be reduced to a single, decisive act of presence. She had stood in front of a room of men, an engineer with a degree and a laptop, and turned listening into labor. In doing so, she had revealed something that the town already knew in its marrow, but had been slow to say out loud. That skill lives in hands that have been taught to care, not only in the tidy lines of papers. At dusk, when the day's last engine had been stilled and the kettle had been emptied of its final cup, Nita put the rag over her shoulder and walked home with Maliha. Their shadows fell long and close. As they passed the hospital, a woman waved from the ambulance through the open window. A nurse who had wanted to thank them both for the hurried night when the pump had refused, and then remembered how it had been coaxed to life. Nida nodded, and the woman nodded back, and in that unspoken exchange was the smallest, truest victory of all. There would be more engines to fix, more arguments to win and lose, more nights when the town's wheels would grind and someone would need a hand, but the shape of the work had changed. Listening had been given a license. The engineer who had once dared for sport found himself returning to a place he had earlier tried to outdo, and in the return became something better than a man with a degree, an apprentice again, his pride tempered by what it felt like to be taught with kindness. At the threshold of the workshop, Nida paused and touched the metal frame as if it were a friend. "We are not small," she said to nobody in particular, and to everything that had ever called itself small. The night answered with engine, cool air, and the slow applause of leaves.